Well, welcome to facsimile number one in the book of Abraham. So much for us to learn here. This is just, there's so much. I'm just so excited to do these. I've been waiting to be able to do these videos for a long time. So these are great. Understand a couple things are important to realize about these facsimiles. Okay, these are drawings that were discovered among the writings that Joseph Smith acquired when he picked up those mummies. If you go back to the beginning of the book of Abraham, we talk about some of the history of it a little bit, of how he got those mummies and how that worked out. In with those mummies were found some books or some scrolls or some writings, basically, that kind of folded up to. Sometimes they were folded up like an accordion type book that you could pull, stretch out if you needed to read it all. Most of this is known as what's known as the Book of the Dead. It's a very common book that is discovered because in Egypt they really believed strongly in resurrection. Resurrection is a very important philosophy and concept to Egyptian culture and to religion. And so they believed, which is why they did the embalming and the preserving of your body, basically, so that you would have a body preserved, it wouldn't decay and fall apart, so that when the gods come back, basically, you can get your body back and go. But they believed also that you had to know certain key things to get past the angels that guarded heaven. They believed that angels guarded the gates to heaven. And in order to get in, you kind of had to know the secret code, like handshakes, a secret name, signs, tokens, that kind of stuff, basically, to get into heaven. That was a very common idea in Egypt. And so you wanted to know those. So what they did is they wrote them down in their ritualistic writings of how to do the embalmings, the prayers, the blessings, to help them in the next life. Those kinds of things were all written down. And then they included that in your burial. So they would mummify your body, put all the wrappings on you. When they put you in your sarcophagus, they would leave this book for you, basically. This is known as the Book of the Dead or the Book of Breathings, because it was there to help you to regain life, basically. So that reference to breath, like we talked about in Abraham 5. So that's what this is. Okay, there's hundreds of copies of the Book of Dead or the Book of Breathings that exist today. They find them all the time in Egyptian archaeological digs. So a very common book. Abraham had one of these with him. Joseph had a copy, had that one basically with him. So the question comes in is when a lot of people try to come up with a reason to hate Joseph Smith, they like to use this idea of the Book of Breathings against Joseph Smith. They try to say, oh, look, Joseph had the Book of Breathings, not a Book of Abraham. The whole Book of Abraham was made up because of that. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll use some of the early apostles' writings to try to interpret this. So one of the things that W. Phelps did was he had a notebook, basically, and he drew some lines in there, and he would put a picture like from the Book of Breathings or something, or a symbol in there, and then try to figure out how to understand what is the interpretation of that symbol. And of course, like most people, they got lost with this idea that the symbol represents something symbolically and has the whole meaning in one symbol, basically. So if you look at Asian writings, okay, Asian culture, their caricatures, they have thousands of caricatures in their alphabet. And the reason is because the caricatures don't necessarily represent a sound as much as they represent a thought or an idea. Okay, in Hebrew writings, one word can have like 13 different meanings to it, depending upon the context it's put in. So Asian writings are sort of there, but more visual in the fact that the caricatures mean something. Like one could be a house or a place of where you live, and another could be another person in there doing something, so you don't read them like an alphabet like we would read in English. You read these caricatures, you understand the interpretation of each caricature, and you put them together to form the thought that author's trying to get across. So they looked at Egyptian the same way. And even early Egyptology hasn't even started really. It was still so early in understanding this at the time that no one really knew how to speak Egyptian at the time that Joseph Smith was doing his translations, and they were trying to do this. So really, they were trying to pioneer how to decode Egyptian writings, basically, because they hadn't really caught on. There were some scholars trying, but no one was really successful at it yet. Not to the extent where they could write a whole book and then other people could read it and then interpret the languages and stuff as well. So it was brand new, very new science. So they were trying to figure it out themselves. And there was a common idea that they were looking at the hieroglyphics as a similar thought process as what you'd have with understanding Asian writings. It wasn't until the Rosetta Stone that was found that unlocked this. The Rosetta Stone is basically a clay tablet. It's a stone, kind of a fire tablet that had the same information on it, the same thought was on it, but in 3 different languages. One was, I think, like a Greek, one was Latin, and then one was Egyptian, or what we know as Coptic. We knew Greek, we knew Latin, so we could interpret those 2 together easily. But then they realized, oh my gosh, the Greek and Latin say the same thing. So if they say the same thing, this must be the same idea also in Egyptian. So they took the Greek and Latin because they knew those languages, and they used that to understand the Egyptian. What they discovered was that Egyptian language is a phonetic language, just like English. So we have a letter in each of our alphabet. That letter represents a sound. So when you combine the letters to form a word, it's a combination of the sounds of those letters coming together. That makes a word, and then several words make a thought. They realized the Egyptian language is a phonetic language, not a character-based language like Asian languages are. So that completely changed what they thought about it. But the early apostles, W.W. Phelps, they use his stuff claiming that Joseph tried to do it because W.W. Phelps would have a symbol on one side of the page, and then on the other side of the page, he would have like a paragraph of the book of Abraham. And he was trying to work backwards to figure out how can what this paragraph says mean something to that character, to try to understand it, kind of reverse translate it basically. And it didn't work. It didn't work at all. He failed miserably at it, and those documents are still around, but they didn't really prove anything or go anywhere. They were in W.W. Phelps' handwriting, and so it was his writing. That was his work. And people try to write that off on Joseph Smith, and it wasn't, okay? Joseph Smith could possibly have had another book that was the Book of Abraham that he translated. Most likely, from everything that I've seen, most likely he didn't translate from a book. He received a revelation like he did with the book of Moses and Abraham and Joseph Smith Matthew, as well as the inspiration that he got for the Wentworth letter that was used for the Articles of Faith. All the rest of the Pearl of Great Price is based upon revelations given to Joseph, not him translating ancient writings. So because of that, I believe that the book of Abraham was a revelation given. He was looking at the book of the dead, but he got a revelation from God that gave him these chapters in the book of Abraham. So these facsimiles come out of the book of the dead. There's different versions or renditions of these facsimiles all over in Egyptian writings. Any book of breathings, book of the dead, would have these in there. Sometimes the symbols are drawn a little different, but it's substantially the same meaning. So just understand this. These are not unique to the book of Abraham. We have hundreds of copies of these same facsimiles with different birds, drawn in different ways, or the people look different in them, things like that. There's some different versions of them, but they substantially mean the same thing in Egyptian lore and culture. So we have an interpretation. Joseph Smith gives us some interpretation of these, and we have these in the context of what happened to Abraham. So we have to understand that there's still a lot of Egyptian history in Abraham's life because he spent time among them, and they dealt with him. So it's not uncommon for these to come together, basically. But these are used to be representative of things, and sometimes stories can be told, that also life experiences can be given to us that have ideas that can be metaphorical for other things as well. Just like the life of Joseph of Egypt, we learn if you get into Genesis chapters 45 through 50, that whole time period there, when Joseph is in Egypt, his life has so many symbolic connections to the life of the Savior. It's amazing. Go watch those videos to see those similarities. So just understand that just because Abraham, we're getting some interpretation from Joseph, and the way Egyptologists translate the Book of the Dead or the Book of Breathings is different, doesn't mean Joseph's wrong in his interpretation of these when Joseph Smith gave us this. When you really look at what Joseph Smith gave us, he is actually right, which means his interpretation of these predates all the Egyptologists. So he was right, basically. So we're going to get into this, and Hugh Nibley gives so much. He wrote 4 books. 4 of the books in the collected works of Hugh Nibley are based around Abraham and the Book of Abraham. So there's a tremendous amount of information we're going to get from all of these facsimiles, and I want to help you understand these as well. So I'm going to kind of scoot over here. There we go. Put the facsimile up. Let's talk about these. So facsimiles 1, 2, and 3 were included as illustrations of the Book of Abraham. So this is Hugh Nibley in his book, One Eternal Round. He says here, in facsimile 1, we see the hero on the altar praying for his life, even as the angel comes to deliver him. Facsimile 3 shows Abraham sitting on an exalted throne. What has happened in the meantime? So what Hugh Nibley is saying here is, the first image, we see the hero of the story on the altar being sacrificed, and he's pleading for his life, and an angel comes down, the symbol of the bird, to save him. Later on in this the hero's life, he's sitting on the throne of Pharaoh, as if he's Pharaoh. So what happened? He went from being sacrificed to being almost like Pharaoh. And he says, what happened in the meantime? That is the subject of facsimile 2, and should cast some light on the hypocephalus, which, as we have just noted, assists the subject in getting from the one world to the other. So what he means by that is facsimile 2, the round one, is called a hypocephalus. There are hundreds of these that they have discovered. Instead of using a Book of the Dead or a Book of Breathings, instead of having a papyrus book in with a mummy, they built a clay tablet for a period of time that had the same type of ideas symbolically represented on it. So the grand key words, the grand things you have to know are there, and they fired these clay tablets into a pillow that the mummy's head would rest on, and it would be thought of as translating that information, because it's close to your brain, your head, your intellect, that information would go with you to the next life, basically. So that's what he's talking about here. Now, Abraham's story tells how it happened and can be matched by some of the richest rabbinical Haggadah, Abraham Apocrypha, and Muslim written traditions, most of which have only come to light in the 20th century. So like I mentioned earlier, these facsimiles are not uncommon in Egyptian archaeological studies. We find them all over the place. The story that we get through the Book of Abraham has been proven true, but we didn't have enough information to prove it true till the 20th century. So the 19th century, when Joseph was alive, they didn't have this information. But after Joseph died, and many decades later, in the 20th century, when archaeology in Egypt took off, we understand this stuff. So there's a tremendous more we get to learn here. Something else on this, in fact, in 1828, Giovanni Anastasi found in the area of Thebes, that's a city in Egypt, a Gnostic sketch matching facsimile number 1 of the Book of Abraham, the companion piece to the hypocephalus. The supremely incompetent draftsman has shown us a man or a mummy supine on an altar with the priest of Anubis standing over him. A single line of text below startles us with the name of Abraham. How could anyone have overlooked it? So what Hugh Nibley is telling us is, in 1828, there actually was found something like this facsimile 1 in a sketch, a Gnostic sketch. Now what that means is it is a sketch that comes from the Christian people who lived in Egypt. Okay, this is long after Abraham had been in Egypt. We're talking about Christian times in there, like the Nag Hammadi library and things. So we're talking about New Testament timeline, basically, of when some Christians were living in Egypt. And they have in some of their writings this facsimile or something very similar to this facsimile. And in the interpretation or understanding of it, they actually have the name of Abraham in it. So we actually have writings from the early Christians who were kind of kicked out of Christianity back in the early centuries after the Savior in the Apostles' time that showed this same facsimile referencing Abraham. How cool is that? It was overlooked a lot. So to understand facsimile number one and how these work out, let's understand some more about Egyptian history and philosophy here. So we need to talk about Abraham and what's known as the year right. Okay, this is very important to understand. It is really fascinating. The rites of the new year, being the death of the old, had to begin with a funeral. So this is, we talk about ancient cultures had this idea of an annual event that signified the end of one year and the beginning of the next year. Okay, so Hunebli says the old prehistoric mysteries of Abydos, wrote Wolfgang Helck, necessarily include both the funeral of the dead king and the installation of his successor. The old king must be buried so that the new king can mount the throne. The two come right together. Things can be arranged so that the old king, who does not want to die, simply stages a mock funeral and burial, followed by a reawakening ceremony taking place after the king had entered the tomb. This is done by having a substitute take the king's place, as is illustrated in the Van Dier Papyrus. The custom is also attested to in Mesopotamia. So what happened is, as the new year began, usually that was the end of winter, not so much December, January in the calendar we have it today, but the end of winter and as the beginning of spring. Spring was seen as new life. So the winter things would die back and go away, and spring was seeing new life. So the new year. So if you think about this, this shouldn't seem strange to us, because we know that this idea of calendars and understanding the solstice was very, very important to ancient times. Whole monuments were built to the solstice. There's Egyptian pyramids that line up with the sun at the solstice period, so we knew when this is the beginning of the festival, when the sun hits this mark and shines its light in this way, that's the beginning of the solstice. They did all this. Even the ancient Nazca lines down in Peru and South America have those lines of those strange big animals that they drew in the desert line up. Some of those lines line up with the times of when the sun hits certain points, like solstices. Okay, Stonehenge was, they believe, a giant clock to predict solstice, to know when the time of harvest, the time of planting, all those things were going to happen. So this concept goes back for thousands of years, understanding that during the reign of the kings, what they would do is they would kind of have to re-up their kingship. So at the beginning of this New Year festival, they would do this tradition where the king would, they do a big celebration, an enemy would come, the king would fight, the king would die, the king would be buried, the enemy would be seen as the winner, the new ruler. Then the king would rise from the dead and defeat the enemy and become the real king, and then he would rule again. So in some cultures, the king literally had to die. So they would do, whenever there was a new transition of power, the people who were vying for that kingdom would come together in ritual combat, and whoever won would be the king. So that was kind of an interpretation of this. Oftentimes, though, these kings would come up and go, you know what, I need to do this every year because of the customs and traditions, but I don't want to die. So what would they do? They would put a substitute in their place. They would get a stranger, dress them up as the king, let them pretend they're the king for the party. Then they would get killed. They would execute them and send them off. And then the real king would come pretend like he's coming back and then take over the throne and rule. So they used a substitute for the death, basically. So this idea of proxy death for the king is not an uncommon idea in the ancient world. And every year they would do this. And there's lots of variations in through Mesopotamia, through ancient South America, all kinds of ancient cultures use this same concept. And so this is what's happening to Abraham. He's being the substitute sacrifice, basically. So facsimile one not only is a symbol of death and burial, this is actually showing commonly how they would bury and mummify bodies and take care of them, but it is also representing this idea of the substitute sacrifice for the year rites for the king. So, okay, let's get into understanding a little bit more specific about facsimile number one. So we have here, he says, what we have here is not merely the telling of a story, but the placing of that story in its proper context of timeless significance. What happens to Abraham and what he does is of enduring effect in the history of the whole human race, past, present, and future. He is one of those key figures in whom all the events of the past are brought into focus as a burning glass, and whose actions are in turn projected into the future as an ever expanding image. So what Hunibli is saying here basically is the whole life of Abraham is somewhat customized to go through certain experiences, to kind of being a magnifying glass to really amplify concepts and ideas that we should still follow in our life. So we can learn a lot about how to improve our life by what happened to Abraham. Okay, so Hunibli says here, what we see here is a moment of immeasurable significance in the history of the race. The messenger bird is there to represent the ruler of all. The crocodile is no less necessary to represent the ancient opposition in all things. The lion is, in early Jewish and Christian parlance, the relentless force that consumes all material things. The lotus is the symbol of the righteous man's pilgrimage through a hostile and dangerous world. Everything has a meaning, and the pillars and expanse of heaven remove the whole story from this transient world to its proper relationship to the eternal plan of things. That's one way of looking at it. So this is what Hunibli is talking about here, is how all of this has symbols to it, and it can represent ideas and metaphor for our life to help us understand things. So let's look at these. So number one in this facsimile is known as the angel of the Lord. That's the bird that's sitting above Abraham's head, representing the angel of the Lord that's coming down to help him, basically, as Abraham is being sacrificed. So if you remember in the book of Abraham, he's being sacrificed on the altar by the priest of Elkanah, and this is the visual representation of it. So Hunibli talks about the angel of the Lord here. He says, Joseph Smith was on very solid ground, identifying the hawk in facsimile one, no matter who drew it, okay, because the original kind of was cut off, so it kind of got filled in by understanding the other versions of this. It kind of had to be filled in later because it was torn, and so they didn't have the full image there. Usually this is representing the gods of Egypt coming, the angel of God kind of coming down to like Ra or those things to come down. But in Joseph is saying this represents for the Abraham ones, the angel of the Lord. He says here, Joseph Smith was on very solid ground, identifying the hawk in facsimile one, no matter who drew it, as the angel of the Lord, because according to Egyptian thinking, the very best way to show an angel was by a hawk. So the hawk has special meaning to there. If you remember, one of the sons in Egyptian literature, Horus, is the hawk, and he is kind of the son of Ra, the god, and so he is seen as a deliverer, an opportunity to send, or a messenger as well, to send messages and do things. The trouble with interpreting Egyptian birds is that there are so many of them, and birds seem to be just naturally symbolical, mantic, if you will. If you look over 100 or so lion couch scenes, you will find that the birds perform in a great variety of roles. Sometimes there are 5, sometimes only 1, but they are all there for a purpose, though not for the same purpose. That is what makes it so confusing. The experts back in 1912 disagreed about the bird in facsimile 1 more than anything else. One scholar said it was one thing and another scholar said it was another. And this one time, when comparison with the other lion couch scenes, only confuses the issue. But here is a study that says that the spirits of the dead are represented by falcons only after the Middle Kingdom. Before that, the hawk and falcon were reserved for the royal Horus alone. There is certainly no shortage of evidence for that. Only in the latest period is the falcon sometimes confused with the soul bird. Here, Louis Klebs tells how the soul bird can signify that the soul is flying away, or that it can serve as a protector or a guide, or brood upon the body as an egg, looking forward to future resurrection, or fan it with its wings to preserve or restore the breath of life, etc. So there's a lot of interpretations of what the hawk means. Basically, is it the spirit leaving the body, as in they're doing the embalming process and things? Is it a God coming down to breathe life back into the body? There's a lot of interpretations. So while the hawk on the ceiling of Tut's tomb may be the king's soul flying away to heaven, he can just as well be flying from heaven as a hawk. If he can go one way, he can go the other. That perhaps is why the hawk is the only symbol to appear in all the known pre-dynastic palettes and maces, because he alone represents the certain tie between heaven and earth. So the hawk was something that was seen in ancient and almost prehistoric Egyptian times as this idea of either it's a spirit leaving or it's a spirit coming. It could be either one. For the ancients, the hawk, which could soar out of the sight in the sky, was the only bird that could fly between heaven and earth, and that could go to the sun and return. If the king was going to heaven, it would have to be as a hawk or falcon, chosen to represent both the soul of the king and the sun to which he returned, because it excelled all other birds known to the Egyptians in its ability to fly at a very great height. That is why we find on the seals of the very earliest kings the majestic image of the hawk dweller in the heaven, sitting above the archaic Serek, the palace gate, as the one who communicates between the earthly and the heavenly dwelling of royalty. Here is a study by the renowned Professor Schott, in which he tells us that the hawk offers the student a particularly useful insight into the relationship between speculation and image in Egyptian thinking. He cites inscriptions telling how the hawk flies up even to heaven, opens his wings to the limits of the world, and speeds through his world to the palace of light. In this capacity, he bears the names of announcer and knower, showing him to be the messenger of messengers. Now, as the one being that can pass freely between the remotest reaches of the universe and the earth, the hawk is preeminently qualified. In fact, he is the only fully qualified candidate for the job of heavenly messenger. If you will look up all the references to wings in the Bible, you will find that wings are never found on angels, but are often referred to in a purely symbolic sense. Just so the Egyptians, as Driaton noted, it did not for a moment believe that an angel would really take the form of a hawk, but thought that a hawk was a very expressive symbol of the way in which angels get around. Gardier, who says that the concept of messengers who performed the behests of the gods is known from the Book of the Dead and elsewhere, e.g. the pyramid texts, is also good enough to point out that the Greeks called such a messenger an angelos, from which our own word angel is derived. The sign of such a messenger is and always was the hawk or falcon. The hawk is the divine messenger who brought the book of wisdom to Thebes, according to Diodorus. Though they understand this symbolically, he explains, it is said at Thebes that a hawk brought the divine book from heaven to the priests. For that reason, the priestly scribes, the hierogrammateus, wear a red rama and a hawk's feather on their heads. So if you ever see Egyptians, like you see like plays or stories about ancient Egypt, you'll see somebody dressed up, they'll have red on. That's part of the priestly robes is red, and they'll have a feather in their head representing the hawk. They are the divine messenger from God. That's the priest. or in this idea, what Joseph Smith again told us, this is the angel of the Lord. This is a divine messenger, somebody sent down from heaven to help us. So all the ideas of what does it mean to be an angel, our idea of angels come from Greek interpretations. Where did the Greeks get it? From understanding ancient Egyptian ideas of the hawk. Egyptians represented angels as the hawk figure. So Joseph Smith is 100% accurate in what he gave us in this facsimile 1. So now we look, figure number 2 on this is Abraham fastened on an altar. So that is an important thing to look at, is that is Abraham on the altar according to Joseph Smith. Now we know that, again, this image is used in Egyptian to also represent the death and burial, the embalming. They're preparing the body to be embalmed for the resurrection. They're planning things. So that's why they say, oh, this is the embalming one, meaning the angel, the hawk, is representing their spirit leaving. So the problem is the idea of death and burial and resurrection are both talked about in here in this symbol, because really they're just different sides of the same event. Death and resurrection, to die, to resurrect. So they're connected very closely, which is why you can get those other interpretations. But what we're being told here in this one is that this is actually representing an experience that Abraham had, which there's tremendous proof around those year rites that happened before. So this is almost ritual, meaning it happens over and over again. So now we have, and by the way, the altar that he is on basically is, if you notice that the altar that he's laying on, it's a symbol of a lion. Okay, that's called the lion couch. We find the lion couch all over in Egyptian writings. The hieroglyphs have them all over the place. The lion couch or the lion bed was a symbol of sacrifice, as well as a symbol of the resurrection, of the embalming, and a symbol of opportunities for the pharaoh to pass judgments, those kinds of things. So that is the altar that he is on. Now, figure 3, let's go to that one, is the idolatrous priest of Elkanah attempting to offer up Abraham as a sacrifice. So remember, we learned in the story that that is the idolatrous priest. He is offering Abraham as a sacrifice. So Hunebly has a few things to say about these priests of Pharaoh. And so let's read this. He says, the first thing to notice is that the priest of Elkanah was also the priest of Pharaoh. That's Abraham 1:7. Since at this time it was the custom, a peculiar custom apparently, and one of limited duration, of the priest of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to offer up upon the altar which was built in the land of Chaldea. That was Abraham 1:8. So a priest was taking the place of Pharaoh in this operation. Question: because Pharaoh was away in Egypt? Answer: not necessarily. Rather, because it was the custom for a priest to do so. Okay, so the office, the high priest, the priest of the priests was Pharaoh. And so the priests were kind of seen as helping Pharaoh. And so they're acting in his behalf. So Hunebly says here, the office was properly the king's, but of course he needed assistance. A study explains that Pharaoh also acted as high priest. Being a son of a god, he could mediate between heaven and earth. Theoretically, each offering was done by the Pharaoh. As Drieton and Jacques Vendier put it, only the king could offer sacrifices. Actually, the clergy carried on for him, but only as a substitute for the royal person. We have seen that the picture of Pharaoh personally sacrificing the enemy chief is found again and again in every period of the Egyptian record. And the sacrificial liturgy makes it perfectly clear that the priest is merely taking the king's place. Hence, the showdown between Abraham and the man with the knife is really the encounter between the prophet and the monarch, no matter who holds the weapon. Likewise, the priest could either wear a jackal mask or simply be bald, as shown in the facsimile. The Salt Papyrus, in fact, specifies that the sacrificing priest be bald. No matter how you view him, he is a hostile figure. So some of them, they actually show the jackal. The priest is a head of a jackal, basically, in some of the Egyptian writings. Whether he's wearing the mask of the jackal, whether he is Pharaoh himself, or he's a priest acting as Pharaoh, or he's bald, as we learn in the Salt Papyrus, uh, doesn't necessarily matter. It's all the same story. Okay, this is ritual, so it's told again and again. Some slight variation sometimes, but it's still there. Now, the knife, this is interesting. If every embalming was a sacrifice, every sacrifice was also an execution, as we have just seen. The priest who sacrifices the oryx says to the king, I make thine arm victorious over the rebels. I place thine enemy under thy knife. In the mysteries of Osiris, the emphasis is on violence as the figure on the couch is surrounded by demons with drawn knives. A peaceful embalming operation is not the idea. The knife, depicted in the first headlock engraving, has very much the shape and size of some of the prehistoric ceremonial knives used by the Egyptians. In chapter 71 of the Book of the Dead, the sacrificial knife is described as representing the crescent moon, the officiant being Thoth, the moon god. According to Keyes, the deadly wounds inflicted by the knife are really the victim's introduction to great things, to hidden knowledge, and to immortality, so that the knife is really an instrument of transfiguration. This is shown, I think, in the late Egyptian story of the contest between truth and falsehood, who, of course, are brothers. Falsehood accuses truth of stealing from him a knife that has miraculous powers, hails him into court, and has him blinded and banished for his supposed crime. But later on, the knife itself turns the tables and inflicts the blows of death, this time real and final, on falsehood, thereby vindicating truth. So you see, it is both a good knife and a bad knife. So this idea that the knife, the symbolic of embalming, meaning you've got to cut the body open and do things, but it's also sacrificing people as well. So there's some ideas, again, a few different ideas of understanding what the meaning of that knife is as they're doing this. Now, Hugh Nibley had a comment to say about the jackal head priest, because a lot of the Egyptian writings show the jackal head priest, and especially when people try to destroy Joseph Smith, they try to show those ones and say, look, they're jackal head priests and all these other ones. They forget that there's other writings that show bald priests, just like what Joseph Smith gave us. So this is what Hugh Nibley had to say. He says, some Egyptian sources use it and some do not. These two scenes on plate 9 are part of the same cartonnage. Apparently, so what this means basically is that there are different, he says that sometimes they use the jackal head on the priest, and sometimes they use bald priests or other things as well to represent the priest. Sometimes it's Pharaoh himself, so it's dressed as if it's Pharaoh. So there's different ways of representing what's going on, whether it was Pharaoh, whether it was the priest, whether the priest was bald or had a jackal head. There's lots of different ways that the same story is told through Egyptian writing. So just because some are used, just because the jackal head is used in some and bald is used in others, doesn't necessarily mean one is false or true. It just means there's different ways that these are being interpreted or are telling the story with a different variation. So, okay, so figure 4, let's go down to figure 4, the altar for sacrifice by the idolatrous priest standing before the gods of Elkanah, Libnah, Machmerah, Korash, and Pharaoh. So this is the altar for sacrifice. That's figure 4. We talk about the lion couch that he is on, and there's tons of tradition of the lion couch in ancient writings for Egyptian. They used it for embalming. They used it for sacrifice. It was like an altar, basically. They used it for some of their ritualistic things, run the year right stuff. Lots of things going on with this lion couch. And sometimes you'll see it kind of a chair, almost like there's a back on it for passing judgment, a pharaoh sitting in it. Lots of stuff that go along with that. It also follows the similar traditions if you go in the book of Genesis and understand the life of Abraham and his nephew Lot, that most of the cities back then, Sodom and Gomorrah and those other cities in that area, they had what would be considered kind of like a lion couch, a metal bed in the middle of the courtyard in their town. Whenever visitors would come, they would grab them, take them to this couch or bed, strap them down to it and kind of contort their body to fit, meaning if they're too short, they would stretch their body out to try to fit the width and height of the bed. If they're too big, they would try to like smash their body together to fit on this bed. And then in the case of the city of Sodom, they would use sticks and other things, and they would literally have their way with these visitors. They would sexually abuse these visitors, which is where the word Sodom comes from, basically, Sodom and Gomorrah. So there's a rich tradition of this lion couch, this bed for sacrifices that does happen all over the place. All right, so figure 5 is the idolatrous god of Elkanah. Figure 6, these are the 4 jars underneath, basically. 5 is Elkanah. Figure 6 is the god of Libnah. Figure 7, the god of Machmarah. Figure 8, the god of Korash. And figure 9 is, which is the crocodile, is the idolatrous god of Pharaoh. So let's talk about the 4 jars that are here, okay? This is important to understand these. They're called the canoptic jars. Okay, very important. The dead person on the embalming table is Osiris on the altar, and the embalming operation is a mimicking of the sacrificial death of Osiris. And just as the members of Osiris were scattered all over the world and had to be brought together again before his resurrection could be accomplished, so those 4 canoptic jars before the couch containing the viscera of the defunct represent the earth in its 4 quarters, exactly as Joseph Smith says they do in Facsimile 2, number 8, basically. So that's Facsimile 2 we're going to get to. Okay, as well as the 4 elements taken from those 4 quarters to make up the body of man. So this is what he was talking about, is the story of Osiris. Osiris is an Egyptian legend. He's a god. He was tricked into giving up his secret name, and then to prevent him from ruling, he was murdered. He was killed and cut up into different pieces. They took him and cut his body into 4 pieces and hid those pieces in different parts of the globe, basically so that he could not come together. So there's legends of trying to bring Osiris together so that he can be resurrected and rule again and take over Egypt from the people that killed at him. It's a crazy story. If you want to read Egyptian history, Egyptian history is absolutely fascinating. So fun to look at. So these jars represent the same idea, basically. What we need to understand is these jars, in the actual process of embalming, these jars, what they would do is they would take the organs, internal organs, out of the chest cavity of the body, and they would put them in the jars. So whenever you see a tomb, an ancient Egyptian tomb, when they go in there and you see those 4 jars, they look like this, in fact, because they're all cut with a different head of a god on each of them. These canoptic jars contain the entrails of the dead person that's in that tomb, basically. They would put them in there to preserve them, and then they could get them back later and put them in their body and in the resurrection. So it's really fascinating how that worked out. So, okay, let's go back here. It says these represent both the dissolution and scattering of the elements of the body, and then the gathering in of those parts and elements for the resurrection. So this idea of this scattering and gathering for the resurrection could also be a cool metaphor for the scattering and gathering of Israel, preparing to the Savior coming. But what makes the sacrificial nature of the couch and the scene plainest of all is the lion motif. The animal heads seem to have been borrowed by the Egyptians in the first place. Originally, the canoptic vases didn't have the animal heads. They were just plain jars. So back in the more early days of Egypt, they were just jars. And then later on, they carved the heads of the jars to be the heads of gods. Scholars believe that the theriomorphic vase in Egypt, as elsewhere, can be traced to an origin in North Syria. Yet the 4 heads are already canonically prescribed in the pyramid texts, so that it is suggested that their appearance in Egypt in the 19th dynasty was actually a return to the old idea. The idea behind the canoptic figure was certainly familiar to Canaan, where, according to the rabbis, the princes of the various nations were typified by animals, just as were the princes of Israel. So they used animals to typify these different princes. Another quote here we have about these canoptic jars or directions. Mr. Jones, this is kind of a conversation that humanly puts together. Mr. Jones, yes, these are the gods of such and such places or persons. Which do you think it was? Places or persons? I'll give you a hint. In Facsimile 2, figure 6, we get the same four critters. What are they there? Jane is speaking to Mr. Jones. They represent this earth and its four quarters. Mr. Jones, so these fancy names probably belong to geographical regions, wouldn't you say? Dick, as a guy in this conversation, he says, unless the geographical regions are also people. Mr. Jones, thanks for that. As far as the Egyptians were concerned, the four quarters of the earth were people. In the book of Abraham, wants to think of the four canoptic jars as representing idolatrous gods and the four regions at the same time. That is entirely in keeping with the way the Egyptians thought about it. Now, right here in the temple of Opet, where we are so much at home, the genies of the four winds enjoy a conspicuous display. And why are they there? The four winds, according to our handbook, head the list of more than 50 ritual appearances of the sacred four. It all began with the four winds and the four directions, represented as early as the pyramid texts by the four canoptic vases. The four idols before the lion couch in Facsimile 1 are the four canoptic vases. As we have seen, they contain the insides of the person on the couch, precisely because they represent the four directions. Let us recall the famous legend of the Jews that Adam was made of the four elements, gathered together as dust from each of the four quarters of the earth, that when one dies, the elements are scattered to the four directions, and that when one is resurrected, they are brought together again. Well, the Egyptians had the same idea. Man was made in the beginning by four gods who represented, or rather, according to Heinrich Brooks, were the four elements. Now, here at the Opet shrine in what is called the Chamber of Spirits, the hero at his rebirth is being approached by good spirits, bringing him good wishes and protection on his birthday. And at the head of the parade come the gods of the four elements, sometimes 8 of them, sometimes 14. Now, the mixing up of the four canoptic idols with the four regions of the universe is found in Egyptian funerary cult at all times, as Budge noted. The four children of Horus, which is what those four heads represent, played a very important part in the funeral works of the early dynasties. They originally represented the four supports of heaven, but very soon each was regarded as the god of one of the four quarters of the earth, and also of that quarter of the heavens which was above it. Whether that is the right explanation or not, the thing to notice is that the four figures represent a number of concepts at once. They are personalities or gods, points of the compass, and also kings and divine patrons of geographical regions. At the same time, they represent the four main stars of the Dipper and the four primal elements of which man and the universe are made. It is interesting that this very temple of Opet, that's a place you can look up, was built of four kinds of stone representing the four basic elements of which the universe was made. The canoptics must participate at the king's resurrection. Crossing the waters to the place of rebirth is explained by an Egyptian gloss as meaning that it is Anubis who is behind the vessel containing the organs of Osiris. Our canoptic jars are both for preservation and resurrection. All four gods of the cardinal points officiate at the baptism of Pharaoh, which, as we have seen, was quadrilateral. What was in fact poured out over the king's head, according to Gardner, was divine power, the specific power of each of the gods of the cardinal points. We have seen that the said festival, which is a festival in Egypt, is a coronation, and that according, like the year rites, the kingly rites, and that according to some of the climax of the festival was the moment when the king released four birds toward the four cardinal points to announce the coronation of the king to the four corners of the earth, which four corners, according to this authority, are none other than the four sons of Horus, represented by the four canoptic jars. Lots of history and tradition in these jars and what they mean. And it's interesting too to realize that the ancient the altar that they used in Moses' time during the time of the portable temple was an altar that had a horn pointing in each direction, four horns representing the four quarters of the world. So they kind of in symbolically represent that themselves in ancient Jewish writings as well. So some fascinating stuff we get to learn in what those really mean and what those are. Now let's look at some of these in a little bit more detail. Let's talk about Elkanah, because Elkanah, this is the priest of Elkanah that's sacrificing Abraham. And the first jar, jar number 5, is the representative of Elkanah, which is the hawk head as well. Remember, that's Horus, one of the sons of Osiris, or Anubis. Osiris. Or the four sons of they represent the four sons of Horus, and Horus is the hawk. So Elkanah, okay, first, the hawk-headed canoptic, the idolatrous god of Elkanah. We learn in Abraham 1:7 that the priest of Elkanah was also the priest of Pharaoh. One priest serving two masters. Since one of the masters was a king, the other may also have been. Bearing in mind that in the common expression, God of so-and-so, the so-and-so is the name of the king or chieftain who established the idol's worship in a district. I would say that Elkanah was a man, but a man with a theophoric name. It's the name of a person made by combining the name of a god with some other element, like Uriah or Jezebel. In Palestine and Syria, it is common to find such names combining Egyptian and West Semitic elements. Well, one of the favorite words of the Egyptians in building such names was Ken or Keni, usually written with a K, which means mighty, powerful, or brave. This element is often used in the first names of various kings, according to the Berlin Dictionary, and is especially appropriate for the conquerors of foreign lands. A typical name is the name of Ammon Ken or Keni Ammon, meaning Ammon is mighty. Ammon is a god of Egypt. According to the dictionary, it is not possible to distinguish the forms kunt, kini, and kunu as the meaning, and the Egyptians often leave the final vowel or consonant unwritten. The Q here represents a very hard K sound, which is impossible to express in English. And I find it most interesting that Joseph Smith sometimes spelled Elkanah with a double K, a very odd and unusual spelling by all accounts, which justifies us in equating Ken, K-E-N, with Ken, Q-E-N. If we go back to the great camp scene of Ramses II, we find that among the four canoptic figures in the shrine, the hawk is represented as saying to the king, I give thee power against the south land, victory against the north, I give thee the lands of the earth. So again, that same idea of that God representing giving power or might, or representing that, even by the name of Elkanah, meaning power or mighty. As a conqueror, Ramses, we might say, Ken consciousness, and since Keni or Kenu or T was commonly used as an appendage of vague and general significance to names of gods, designations of kings, and the like. It is a natural for the name of an idol, since it was common in Palestine and Syria to combine Egyptian and Canaanitish elements in the same names. Nothing could be more in order than to call an idol El-Kanah, meaning the god El is mighty. Canaan in Abraham's day was full of what E.C.B. McLaren calls synthesized titles, and he calls special attention to the name Elkanah. The commonest element in such names was some word for strong or mighty coupled with the name of the god. Thus, El Elyon or Baal Elyon means that the god is victorious, a powerful hero. Equally common is the Egyptian Kun or Kani, and the well-attested name Kni Ra of Ra Kni is the exact equivalent of Elkanah. The Egyptians being much interested in identifying their Ra with the Canaanite El. So Ra is the sun god, the main god, the god of all gods, and El is the name of the god of gods among the Canaanites. So they equated those together, and sometimes you'd get those combining some of the Canaanite terms and Egyptian terms would come together, like in the word Elkanah. Let's see. In view of the latest study by Father Roland DeVoe, according to him, the land of Canaan is designated in the Amarna letters as the land of Kinani, or Kinhahi. Sorry, some of these are hard to pronounce. The Amarna letters, you may recall, were written in Babylonian cuneiform, but discovered in the library of a famous pharaoh. The point is that all over the Egyptian, Syrio-Palestinian era, Kinna was a common designation for Canaan, and the name Elkanah could certainly mean God of Kenna or Canaan. But this suggests a third possibility. It so happened, that each of the four canoptic jars represented not only one of the four winds or four directions of the compass, but also that particular part of the inhabited world which lay in that particular direction. It also happens that the hawk-headed canoptic figure always stood for the lands of the east, Elkanah or Elkanur, hawk, stomach east desert people. Pretty fascinating how the word Elkanah actually means some really significant things that goes along with this. All right, now Libnah, let's talk about him. That's the number 6, the god of Libnah. He is the jackal head. So Libnah, the jackal in Testine's west, or lands of the west, the name has actually turned up in the Egyptian records and being obligingly transposed into Good Canaanite by Professor Max Bruckart as plain and simple Libnah, designating an unknown geographical region. Also, however you look at it, it always means the same thing. Take the Semitic root LBN, Liban. What do Mount Lebanon, the snow-covered, Leban, which is Arabic for milk, or Lebanah, which is Hebrew for moon, have in common? So this is that conversation that Hunibli's kind of giving among a scholar and his students here. Dick says, that's easy. They are all white. Mr. Jones, shining white. And according to the rabbis, the name of Abraham's relative Laban means white face or blonde. Another indication of blondness in Abraham's family. So you remember, so I had my camera got bumped, sorry. If you remember, Abraham's wife, Isaac's wife as well, and Jacob's wife, they were very gorgeous women, and a lot of the ancient writings talk about them being blonde women. So they're shining white. According to the rabbis, then, I just read that part, sorry. And in the Holy Indo-European family, what do Alps, lamps, Olympus, and all limpid and lambent things have in common? They too are shining white. The ending "a" would normally be the feminine ending designating a land or region as the mother of its inhabitants, as the formula goes. Now, Libnah would be the white land, and there were places in Palestine in Abraham's day called Libnah, whiteness. Then too, Levi had a son, Libni, whose name meant white. So Jane says, what is the white land then? Mr. Jones says, that is just what Keyes asked himself. He decided that Lord of the White Land is derived from the idea of Lord of the Shining, sanctified land, that being a euphemism for the necropolis. Now Dick says, and everybody knows that the necropolis is in the west. That would make him Lord of the Westerners. Jane says, but wasn't Upper Egypt the southern kingdom? The land of the white crown and the white palace and the white mace and all that? Mr. Jones says, there was a strong temptation once to locate the white land of Anubis in Abydos, but Keyes showed that white land does not necessarily refer to Upper Egypt, though he admitted that the meaning of the term remained obscure. So let me just pause for a second here and give you a little bit of background on what they're talking about here, okay? Egypt, ancient Egypt, before we get into the dynasties of the reigns of pharaohs and things, Egypt was two kingdoms. There was kind of a big land, and then it was divided into two kingdoms, two brothers fought to be the king, and so rather than fight, they ended up making two kingdoms basically. So one was the lower Egypt, which is northern Egypt. Okay, Egyptian geography is backwards. Okay, remember the mountains. The higher level of Egypt is in the south. Okay, Central Africa. The lower part of Egypt, so the Nile runs from the south to the north. It's one of few rivers that actually runs north, basically, because it runs from the mountains in Central Africa to the north to the lower lying area, which is the Mediterranean. Okay, so known as Upper Egypt is the southern Egypt. Lower Egypt is northern Egypt. Okay, so you have to understand that that's the plains area where the Nile would flood. Upper Egypt is southern Egypt where the mountain regions were. So you've just got to understand and realize that it feels a little backwards when you look at Egyptian writings. But the pharaoh, the king of southern Egypt or Upper Egypt, had a tall white hat that he used. Northern Egypt or Lower Egypt was the red hat of the bee king, Worstwort, Deseret, basically. And then eventually they came together. So when you see a pharaoh in ancient Egyptian writings with a red hat only or a white hat only, they're talking about those two kingdoms, not the gods, but the kings of the two kingdoms. They eventually come together under and are united under one king. He takes over, I think it was the southern kingdom took over the northern kingdom, and he merged them into one. And what he did is he took the red hat and the white hat and combined them. So if you see a hat that kind of has this red outer strand and a white smooth part coming out of the top of it, it kind of looks like two hats. It's because that's the pharaoh of the combined kingdoms, basically. So that just gives a bit of background into what's going on in here. Okay, so let's jump back in this. He says here, but very early, Bruch noted that of the four canonical colors, the official color of the West is surprisingly white, instead of a red sunset. On the other hand, the Libyans to the west of Egypt, noted for their white skin and blue eyes, were identified by Josephus with the lehabim, form of a root lib, meaning shining or flashing, Arabic lubna, a clear white color, brightness of the complexion or color of the skin, according to Lane. But let's avoid too much playing around with words and sounds, which is altogether too easy, and settle for a few fairly certain points. Libna does mean white land. The idolatrous god of Libna does have the mask of Anubis. The jackal-headed canoptic figure does stand for the west. Anubis is the lord of the west. He is also lord of the white land. White is the ritual color of the west. That's enough, without bringing in the white Libyans to give you something to play with. It doesn't prove anything except perhaps that Libna is a very appropriate name to use if you want to divide up the world into four regions or races according to Egyptian practice. So that symbol is 100% accurate in what it says there. All right, let's go to figure 7. Hopefully you guys are really enjoying this. Figure 7, that is the idolatrous god of Makhmara, and that is the ape head. Basically, that's the head of the ape. Okay, or the bull or cow also is very commonly used in there. These are the lungs, or North Palestine and Syria. So this is the god of Makhmara. So figure 7, the idolatrous god of Makhmara has an ape's head, though sometimes it is shown with the head of a bull or a cow. That would be the apis bull, which is another common symbol in Egyptian religion to represent a god. The Egyptians placed it at the northern quarter of the horizon. What makes its name so intriguing is that it makes sense almost any way you divide it up. We must always bear in mind, when confronted with the often exotic-looking foreign names that occur in the writings of Joseph Smith, that it is the sound and not the sight of the name that is being conveyed. Barak El and Shamhayimi are perfectly good Hebrew if you read them out loud, though they look absolutely outlandish. It would be hard to give a better rendering of the old sounds without the use of a phonetic alphabet. The names of our canoptics are addressed to the ear and not the I. That is why it is possible to fluctuate between Elkanah and Elkanah, Korash and Koash. Machmerah suggests all sorts of things to the ear. And it would take us a long time to ring all the possible combinations that Semitic and Indo-European dictionaries could give us on the syllables ma, mak, and ra, all of which are full of meaning in any language. What grabs me, for example, is the middle syllable, not plain mak, but makr, and of course the final ra. What I hear is ma, makr, ra. That means a lot to me. So this is that conversation, that theoretical conversation that a scholar is having with his students. That's where I got this from. I broke it up for the different gods basically here. So Jane asks, why Makr of all things? Mr. Jones says, because it reminds me of an element occurring in some important Canaanite names. Maher-nt or Maher-anat, for example, means champion or upholder of the goddess Anat. And Ramses II called himself Maher-Baal, meaning upholder of Baal, the Canaanite god. Maher-Ra could be the champion or upholder of Ra, the Egyptian equivalent of Baal. So Dick comes in here, but this Makr is spelled with a CK instead of an H. Mr. Jones, the H in Maher belongs to the root and must have a heavy sound in order not to be swallowed up by the following R. You can see the shift between a K and a heavy H sound in our writing of Michael, which Jews wrote Mikael. Incidentally, the form of the name rather neatly parallels our Ma Makr Ra, Mikael or Micaiah, means who is like God, or he who is like God. Ma, written M-A-H to lengthen the vowel according to the invariable practice in Mormon scriptures, is the exact Egyptian equivalent of the Hebrew my or me, so that Ma Makr Ra would mean who is the upholder of Ra, or the like, a very appropriate title for an idol whose worshippers were doing everything they could to equate and associate the gods of Canaan and Egypt. But here is another possibility. Among the old Canaanite names found in Egyptian is Magar, plus a vowel ending, transposed into Canaanite as Mak-ara, meaning place of burning. Since Abraham was known anciently as he who escaped the burning, Ma-Makra could be the local deity of the place of sacrifice. Though no precise geographical location is provided for some of Abraham's most important experiences, a good deal of being written today, as we shall see, about his many confrontations with local gods in Canaan. Here is the idolatrous god of Beth-shan, who is called Mikol, the great god. The first element in his name, Mikol, is Canaanite, but the second, is Egyptian. The first refers to the Canaanite god Mikolah, whose name, according to L.H. Vincent, means he who is able, the omnipotent, while the second is the Egyptian word for great, practically the same thing. So that the combination gives us a very powerful figure indeed. Makol the mighty, the god of power. Incidentally, since Semitic L is regularly written as an R in the Egyptian renderings, the Egyptian form of this name would be Makra. But I do think it is in order to point out that the well-documented name Mekra exactly parallels Elkanah. In each case, the name of a Canaanite god is followed by an Egyptian epithet meaning mighty. I can think of a better Egyptian name though. Herman Rank gives the name Mai-em Haka as meaning the lion is ruler. On this pattern, Mai-em Hakara would mean the lion is Aker the Great. Aker being the earth god as a lion. At any rate, we are free to guess as long as we don't preach. Jane says, but what's it got to do with an ape's head? Mr. Jones, don't you remember? The jar with the ape's head signifies north for the Egyptians. That is the purpose of this particular symbol. For the Egyptians, Palestine and Syria were the lands of the north. Fascinating how all that ties together, isn't it? So cool. So cool. If you want to read the whole thing, this is in the book, A New Approach to Abraham by Hugh Nibley. Fascinating stuff. All right, let's get to the next one. This is figure 8, the idolatrous god of Korash. Korash means human, or it's the liver or south, is what it represents. So here we go. Our last canoptic, figure 8, is the human head Imset, who in the Egyptian system stood for the south. All that remains to test in the book of Abraham is his name, which is given as Korash or Koash. The different spellings given to proper names in the book of Abraham are plainly an effort to approximate their sounds. As might be expected, it is especially the R that causes trouble. Elkanah appears as Elkanah and Korash as Koash. Also Jershon as Jershon and Potiphar as Potiphar. Your R is a great troublemaker in ancient as well as in modern languages. If you ask me which of the forms is correct, I unhesitatingly answer they all are. Anybody who knows anything about Arabic also knows that you can't insist dogmatically on one official pronunciation for any single word. And it has always been that way in the East. One of the reasons why it's so hard to understand some of these ancient writings. Basically, it's hard to pronounce them properly, and the pronunciation, the sound it makes, is what it's trying to convey. It's not so much the word on the paper as it is the sound that it makes that's conveying the message, the meaning to you, basically. Here is an Egyptian Canaanite deity whose name can be read as Kesert, Keserti, Keset, Kosur, and Chrysor, and that is typical. But what does Koash remind you of? A Bible land far to the south of everything? Jane says, the land of Cush. Mr. Jones, of course. The most succinct essay on Cush is in the New Standard Jewish Encyclopedia, which defines Cush as region south of Egypt, Nubia or Ethiopia, in Hebrew and other ancient languages. Now it extends south from Elephantine and Syene or Aswan. It has also been identified with southern Arabia and even India. The names of the four brothers, Mizraim, Punt, Canaan, and Cush, certainly remind us of the division of the world into four regions. So these are the descendants of the children of Noah, remember, and they disperse out. Now, those aren't the four names of Noah's children, but it's the descendants later on down the road of them, and a lot of them are from Ham, basically, which cover the whole known world at the time in that area. There is still no agreement as to where the lands of Punt and Cush really were, but the queen of Punt, who had dealings with Queen Hatshepsut, which is a female pharaoh, a warrior princess, basically in Egyptian history, really cool lady to study. She certainly, who had dealings with queens, certainly lived in the south. So Punt was in the south, where we would call somewhere around, like I talked about, that would be Ethiopia, and those areas, basically. So finally, a tradition preserved by the Arabic writers designates by the name of Korash or Cush, the father or grandfather of the very king who tried to put Abraham to death. The root curse can be tied to a great number of meanings, but as a proper name, it is peculiarly at home in the south and tied to the worship of the most important Egyptian goddess. Since the south is the only direction we have left and the human head canoptic jar does stand for the south, we may as well let it stand there for the present. So that is fascinating. So those four canoptic jars that we talked about, the four corridors of the earth, the four cardinal directions, the four common types of gods or people in the area, so much is built into this, the symbolism of those. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. All right, we got a few more figures to go. The video's getting a little long, but hopefully you're really enjoying what we're learning. Put in the comments too what you think. What are your thoughts and ideas? What comes to your mind as you learn and start to dissect this facsimile number 1 and how this relates, basically, not just with the story of Abraham, but with just philosophies and theories and ideas that exist out there. So while you're doing that, we're going to get on to figure 9, the idolatrous god of Pharaoh, which is represented as a crocodile in the ground or under the ground, basically. So the Egyptians assigned the same primary functions to lions and crocodiles as you just did. This is that story that Hugh put together in his book. Their business is to chase people. If the lion fortress guarded the northeast frontier of Egypt, the crocodiles that swarmed in the lakes and marshes there actually did keep unwelcome Arab and Libyan invaders from crossing over without authorization, or fugitives from Egypt from escaping. So lions on one side, crocodiles on the other, kind of had a similar purpose or meaning of how they did things. In the Egyptian romances, the hero's crossing to the other world is barred at the desert by lions and at the waters by crocodiles. In the temple of Seti I, two crocodiles kneel under two lion-headed gods holding huge sacrificial knives, with the sacred head of Osiris on a pole before them. And here is a funeral scene in which Nefertem, the lion, sacrifices the enemy of Egypt in rites at which Sobek, the crocodile, presides. A terrible duo, but just as the Egyptians, through long familiarity, began to value certain traits of the lion, so they saw that the crocodile was not without its virtues. Ferocity, fecundity, and above all, rapacity were the conspicuous qualities of the beast. And if those qualities in the crocodile, the lion, and the wolf, in that order, inspire a sort of awe, they are not without their usefulness. The world needs scavengers, especially in exuberantly fertile subtropical regions such as Egypt. But still, Dick is right, referencing this little story that was put together. The good done by marauding and preparatory beasts is not very obvious. Philo, who lived all his life in Egypt, scratched his head in wonder and protested that it was reasonable enough to venerate useful and gentle animals if you must venerate animals at all. But why crocodiles and lions? What could be more ridiculous? And Origen, a native Egyptian, says that he has never been able to find an explanation for such foolishness, because the Egyptians did worship the crocodile, even though they hated it. It was a prized paradox even for Egypt. From the earliest times, the crocodile was worshipped in some parts of Egypt, and at all times, his cult was one of the most important of the land. Priests would feed and groom the beasts lovingly at their shrines, where sometimes they became quite tame. The Egyptians were quite aware of the more unlovely attributes of the crocodile. In some parts of the country, it was considered the vilest of creatures and hunted down, and yet others, wrote Strabo, though aware of its dangerous and hateful nature, still worshipped it and kept their distance. Those who hunted and even ate the crocodiles justified their action by saying that the beast was everything evil, a creature of Typhon, the mortal enemy of Horus. In some parts of Egypt, people would swim along with the crocs, but not far away, others would not even approach the shore where crocodiles might be found. While at Crocodilopolis, the animals were sacrosanct. A few miles away at Apollinopolis, the populace waged systematic war against them. Plutarch says the explanation must be sought not in logical thinking, but in some mantic power attributed to the animal, and that one pharaoh died for scorning that particular power. Terrifying is the crocodile which the gods fear, says a coffin text. That's like the Book of the Dead. And Dryaton notes that the only reason the dead might want to change into a crocodile is to inspire fear. It stands for all the worst human attributes. Theodor Hopfner has collected Egyptian terror stories of the bloody crocodiles, which could be scarier than any ghost stories, for the real crocodiles were not far away. Naturally, there were lots of charms against crocodiles, especially to render them harmless while one passing by the places where they lurked. But still, the Egyptians reverenced the beast. It wasn't just that some Egyptians worshipped crocodiles and some hated them, but that the same people felt mixed emotions. W. M. Flinders Petrie insisted that the Egyptians all hated the crocs, but were so terribly afraid of them that they had to worship them to propitiate them. The crocodile, he wrote, was always feared and only worshipped in depreciation. This is borne out by this text from the famous Papyrus of Ani, where bowings and prostrations were made to the terrible crocodile, ravening and dangerous. As Strabo put it, they worshiped the most hateful of all animals, the crocodile, to avoid it. The equivocal position of the poor Egyptians was like that of the people of India toward their expensive sacred cows. The country simply swarms with crocodiles, Diodorus reported, because the people would not catch them, considering them to be sacred, and yet they very much appreciated the work of the little ichneumon in destroying and feeding on crocodile eggs. That's a bird. When the son of the first, I believe it's a bird actually. When the son of the first governor of Alexandria was eaten by a crocodile, the priest paid an enormous fine to the governor to keep the animals from being hunted, for they reverenced the crocodile and did not want it killed. There were mixed emotions, you see, though some made an issue and took sides for and against the crocs, as Herodotus and Athanasius report. Pliny and Ammianus say the same crocs would be well behaved during certain ceremonial occasions, but dangerous the rest of the time. Gardner wrote, "We find ourselves plunged into a world of imagery barely credible to the modern mind when we consider the Egyptian attitude to the crocodile and regard this as an instructive lesson in just how perverse ancient thought can be. But it makes good sense if we consider a number of things. First of all, the crocodile was exactly what Joseph Smith calls him in Facsimile 1, figure 9, the idolatrous god of Pharaoh. What most surprises Gardner, in fact, is that for all its less attractive aspects, it was this voracious creature whom an accident of history had raised to the position of chief divinity of Egypt. He was not only the chief divinity, and that already in the Middle Kingdom, but peculiarly the special god of Pharaoh. It was not only the most unloved of creatures, it was also the most highly venerated. It was exclusively and particularly the king's own totem, or rather, since there has never been any agreement about totemism in Egypt, Crocodipolis was always one of the top cult places in Egypt, and the crocodile cult was always important throughout the entire land. The story was told at Crocodipolis that Menes, the first king of a united Egypt, was once pursued by his own dogs while hunting and was rescued and carried to safety across the waters by a crocodile. Here is a pyramid text that actually says that the king is Sobek the Croc, even though we read in another pyramid text that this same Sobek is a vile and licentious beast. Still, other pyramid texts show that in those early times, the deified king appears in vital power in the water as a crocodile, which Keyes calls a concept of prehistoric antiquity. Here in the pyramid of Unas, the last king of the 5th dynasty, he appears as a wild bull, but along with that, the king is also Sobek, which Joachim Spiegel thinks as a lower Egyptian idea. At any rate, it is accepted everywhere. Here in this Middle Kingdom mural from Medinet Habu, the king is the bull of the desert, but he wears the costume of Sobek, the crocodile. By the 5th dynasty, the anthropomorphic or crocodile-headed Sobek appears wearing various royal crowns, and by the 12th dynasty, he is attached to and even identified with the sun god Ra. Here is a Middle Kingdom hymn to Sobek. Sobek the Shaddite appears gloriously. He has taken rulership of heaven and has filled the two lands with his power. It goes on to say that he wears the worst wort crown of the bee crown, and is worshipped by the sun folk in Heliopolis. That he seizes the mixed scepter and the wort crown, ruler among the gods, who steals the wort crown. So he's the god of both kingdoms of Egypt. So Jane says, but how could a dirty old crocodile ever be the sun? Mr. Jones, in the hymns, it calls him the duplicate of Ra, great luminary that came forth from the flood, the son of Neith in Abydos. I think that explains it. Sobek is understandably the god of the shallow waters from which life emerged in the beginning. He appears out of the water even as the sun appears. Rising dynasty, the anthropomorphic or crocodile-headed Sobek, appears wearing various royal crowns, and by the 12th dynasty, he is attached to and even identified with the sun god Ra. I think I just copied that. Sorry, that was weird. Comes up again. Let's see, where did that go? So let's see. He appears out of the water, even as the sun appears riding from the primordial waters on the first day in splendor. So I think I copied that paragraph twice in there when I pulled these over. He is the only animal I know of that spends half his time basking in the tropical sun and the other half basking in the tropical water. Here is a coffin text that describes a monster crocodile, the Lord of Baku, holding out with the huge serpents of primordial times in sacred and dangerous haunts above the river. It is the sort of thing that could go way back. In this text, the first of all thrones, the throne of the king of everything, is established at the place of the four crocodiles. The king explaining to the crocs who occupy the four regions that he is going to create the realm of Ra anew on earth and asking for their approval. It is as if the crocodiles, as the original inhabitants of the land, must grant permission to the king himself to settle and take over. At any rate, by the Middle Kingdom, the Sobek element in the royal names shows that the crocodile god was still thought of as somehow connected with the monarchy, according to Gardner. Now, this was a survival of older times, but it carried right over until the end. In fact, in the later dynasties, the kings of Egypt were especially devoted to the crocodile. Bonnet has given us a useful summary of the whole story. In the 12th dynasty, it says Sobek became a god of the residence and as such came to be very close to the royal house. And also the kings of the 13th to 17th dynasties, where most scholars put Abraham incidentally, prefer names containing homage to the crocodile. Note that homage to the crocodile. Here on a crocodile statue, it says that Sobek is the Horus who resides at Crocodipolis, and that the king is a unique friend of Sobek. Here it says, may the king make offerings to Sobek of Crocodipolis, who is described as a depository of all the attributes of power and authority. Gardner is right. The croc has something very special to do with royal power. Here is a papyrus from the Fayum that depicts the crocodile not as Pharaoh, but as the god of Pharaoh. According to Bonnet, the submission of Pharaoh to the crocodile down to the latest times is attested by the association of the crocodile with the royal image on the monuments and in annals. Hence, even the Ptolemies, who are the Greek pharaohs, basically, reverenced the crocodile as their ancestor. And so Bonnet sums it up. Sobek absorbs the god of the king into himself, so that hymns of praise to the king and his crowns can be addressed directly to Sobek. That is, the croc is the god of Pharaoh. Bonnet believes that it all goes back to the early identity with the rising sun god, which explains why the Egyptians were fond of designating Sobek as nothing less than the living image, or even more popularly, the Ka, the power and essence of Ra, so that he finally ends up like Pharaoh as nothing less than the universal god. You will never find a croc like that in an embalming scene. What good would he do there? But in a sacrificial setting, he is right at home. So the fact that the crocodile is in this image tells us this is not an embalming scene. This is a sacrificing scene, because there's no need to represent the crocodile in the embalming scene. In the great festival of Kohoik, Horus, comes bringing on the water, the members of Osiris in his form of a crocodile. A transformation takes place in the temple of Osiris in his name of Crocodile, Lord of Amu, and all this takes place as part of a lion couch rite. In the Joseph Smith Papyrus, it makes little difference whether we think of the crocodile as Horus or Seth. In either case, he provides an unmistakable clue to the kind of death the person on the couch must face. As the idolatrous god of Pharaoh, he is the form in which Pharaoh is able to consume the flesh and blood of his victims, an idea often expressed in the sacrificial liturgy, and to be refreshed and renewed by them. Remember those early sacrificial texts we read in which the king was told that the enemy's blood was being shed so that he could be revived and rejuvenated by it? It was not enough merely to shed blood, it had to be consumed in some way. And by whom more effectively than by the efficient scavengers to whom the hearts and heads of sacrificial victims were thrown? the terrifying embodiment of primordial kingship that swarmed in sacred immunity around the oldest sacrificial altars of the land, so it is anything but fantastic to designate the crocodile in Facsimile 1 as the idolatrous god of Pharaoh in his capacity of participating in a sacrificial scene. How amazing is it that Joseph Smith's interpretation got it right? He was almost one of the first person to actually translate or give us an English interpretation of Egyptian writings. And this is fascinating that he got it so right on the head. I mean, could you imagine that? Someone with what we'd call a first grade education? Imagine a first grader trying to understand what this means and coming up with this and proving that it works so perfectly well. How amazing this is. Oh, this is so cool. So, so cool. Okay, now figure 10 represents Abraham in Egypt. Okay, now this is actually figure 10. If you notice on here, if you look up here, is next to the little table with a flower on it. The flower is the lotus, which is a common flower in Egypt. So let's look at the lotus flower here. Now, one thing there is no doubt at all, and that is the lotus is the symbol of the land of Egypt, in particular of Lower Egypt, where Abraham was visiting. Also, the lotus is the embodiment of Pharaoh as the ruling power of Egypt, a beneficent and hospitable power. Characteristic of the lotus is that it is most at home in situations of hospitality, where it represents both guest and host. In both capacities, it can represent individuals, including foreigners in Egypt. A wall painting from an 18th dynasty tomb shows a Syrian bringing a magnificent lotus offering to Pharaoh, just as any good Egyptian would. According to Joseph Smith, the lotus in figure 10 represents two entities and specifies their relationship. It is Abraham and Egypt. Abraham as a guest and Egypt as host. We can refine the image by bringing in a good deal of interesting and relevant data. The special function of the lotus in protecting strangers. The lotus is the stamp of official protection and safe conduct, sort of a visa, as it were. The lotus as the mark of the frontier control station through which Abraham would have to pass. That customs house is the scene of an important Abraham legend. The oddity of the lotus in this particular scene. In one important context, the lotus marks the trail of the righteous man, the messenger of truth, bearing his light into dark and dangerous places. The lotus was identified with Hercules as the wandering benefactor of mankind, the perennial stranger and guest. It sprang up in the footsteps of the Bodhisattva when he went forth to bring light into a benighted world. The god of wisdom held the lotus in his hand as he rode on his lion into China to take the shining truth to the ends of the earth. Let me ask you, who is the archetype of the righteous man, the bearer of revelation and preacher of righteousness, the courageous stranger in alien and hostile countries and courts? Who but Abraham the wanderer? In the very early Judeo-Christian hymns of Thomas, the righteous man in the world is compared with the king's son spending a dangerous sojourn in the land of Egypt, following the ancient and established prototype of Abraham in Egypt. Abraham is qualified, if anyone is, for that distinguished company of wandering, inspired teachers whose symbol is the lotus. And so I don't know just how surprised we should be to find a 19th century prophet designating the lotus as the symbol of Abraham in Egypt. How amazing that is. Oh, I just love this. This is so fascinating what we get to learn. All right, two more figures. Let's see, figure 11, designated to represent the pillars of heaven as understood by the Egyptians. So we're going to get into understanding these as well. There's a little bit more here, actually. This is about the lotus. Sorry, I jumped ahead. I'm sorry, I'm just so excited. This is great stuff. Let's talk about this. This is an idea of the Shoshankoids and the lotus. This is a bit more about the story of lotus and the history of it. The book of Abraham emphasizes the completely ritual nature of what Abraham had to go through, and that special emphasis is placed on the lotus as symbolic of the land of Egypt. It is an interesting coincidence that it is in the dynasty of Sheshank that the lotus receives special attention. Under that king, chalices with lotuses commemorate the ascension or a claim to the kingship when the claim is not strong, or a sed festival. That's the year rites festivals. The symbol of the infant son on the lotus at Hermopolis is on one of the chalices is connected with some event in the reign of Sheshank I. The lotus occurs on all three facsimiles in the Book of Abraham, where it is explained by Joseph Smith as denoting Abraham in Egypt. It was under Sheshank I that chalices with the infant son on the lotus figured prominently in the Great New Year's mystery drama of the sun god. Though from an early period we find it, the lotus, closely associated with Egyptian gods and kings. It is especially in the great religious revival of the Sheshankids that it comes to our attention. In this great relief on the wall at Karnak, Sheshank I treats us to the only appearance of the whole corpus of Egyptian writing of the name of Abraham. In 1904, James Breasted commented on lines 71 and 72 of this inscription, which can be nothing else than the field of Abram. We already have the name of Jacob on the list of Tutmos III and probably also that of Joseph. So what's fascinating is we have the names Jacob, Joseph, and Abraham as being in Egyptian writings. They're there, but there's not much told about them, but we do find little glimpses of them there, which is really cool. And connected with the lotus flower. How cool is that? Now, something that's important to understand is this lotus flower is appearing on the right side of the image, okay? Left and right on images does make a difference in Egyptian understanding. So let's look at this, okay? A number of studies have demonstrated that the Egyptian artists always drew people in the right profile whenever he could. So if you look at the profile of the person on the table and the priest of Elkanah, okay, while the left profile is shown as a mirror image. So our priest is properly shown in right profile. But at the same time, in a two-dimensional drawing, the Egyptian artist was afraid of crisscrossing. So he simply put the knife in the other hand. Comparison of Egyptian drawings and statues reveals that when a figure is shown as left-handed in a drawing, the same figure in the same attitude is seen to be right-handed in his statue, which proved to Professor Helmut Müller that the left-handedness of the drawing figures is merely a convention to avoid the crossing of arms. In Joseph Smith Papyrus 1, the left-handedness of the priest, like the awkward position of his legs, is an unavoidable consequence of telling a particular story. It comes from the necessity of having two main figures oppose each other. The preference of Egyptian artists for the right profile is one of the canons of their art and belongs to the same order that requires hieroglyphic figures to face toward the beginning of a text, so that the procession seems to move backwards. So when you look at Egyptian writings, they're positioned that way for a reason, and they're pointing to the beginning of the texts. So it almost feels like they're, if you were to put motion to it, they're working backwards, but it's to point to the text to help you understand the story better, and to be able to draw a three-dimensional idea in two-dimensional space, basically. Supposedly, because the procession must start from a holy shrine or person, and since no one may turn his back on divinity, gods and mortals must always face each other. That is, they must face in opposite directions. Hence, the rule that while mortals are drawn in right profile, gods must be shown in the left. It has been increasingly clear that the direction in which figures face is something to be taken seriously in understanding Egyptian art, and it may furnish an important clue to the meaning of the Joseph Smith Papyrus. So realize they're facing the direction they are for a reason, and that tells us something about this story, gives us context to understand the story better. Notice that the priest, The lion and the crocodile all face in the same direction, showing their right profiles. What do they all have in common? They take life. They are considered sinister figures, literally sinister, on the left. In Egyptian common speech, to see the face of the crocodile was to die. And priest, lion, knife, and crocodile all show the man on the couch to be in grave jeopardy. All the other figures, on the other hand, face in the opposite direction, the direction in which the immortals face, all of them being invested with divine power to save lives. The hawk comes to rescue the hero. The four canoptic figures have always the function of protecting the body from harm and assisting in its resurrection. The lotus revives the head and protects the living. Finally, the figure on the couch is brought face to face with his rival and would-be destroyer. The whole composition proclaims the conflict of two forces. This is emphasized deliberately by the introduction of figures not found in other lion couch scenes. The lotus and the crocodile, which to the Egyptian mind represents the ultimate extremes, respectively, of destruction and preservation. Having taken such special pains to give a particular interpretation to the scene, the artist cannot be denied the privilege of putting such an object as a knife in the priest's hand. Notice in the facsimile how that knife dominates the picture. It is exactly in the center of vision and exactly halfway between the eye of Abraham and the eye of the priest. It is the focal point of the whole scene, as it should be. How fascinating is that? You probably never thought about the direction things are facing and how that made a difference. But now you can see it. So this is cool because if you understand this, not only does this make these facsimiles more important to us to understand who's facing on the right side, who's facing on the left side, but it also helps us if you're looking at any Egyptian hieroglyphs to get a better idea of what's going on. So how cool is it that by learning about these facsimiles, you're actually learning how to understand hieroglyphs and Egyptian art? Cool, huh? So neat. So neat. All right. A little bit more on the lotus flower before we move on. We've got a lot here. This is a small, if you look on there, it's a small part. I think most people completely forget it's there and they just ignore it, basically. But it's a powerful part of this telling of the story, and specifically this one. Not every scene that Facsimile 1, there's lots of versions of Facsimile 1 out there, like we talked about. This scene is specific because of the lotus. The lotus isn't in all the other ones. It's specifically for this one, okay, and in a few other ones. So no subject has been the object of more study and publication since 1912 than the meaning of the lotus to the Egyptians. And the very latest study, that of Peter Munro, concludes with the declaration that the many identifications of the lotus with this and that are still imperfect and only tentative, and that we do not yet know how or when or where the lotus came to be associated with so many different ideas and individuals in the Egyptian mind. Our job is to find out, if we can, what the particular lotus design in Facsimile 1 and 3 represents, and it is not going to be easy. Dr. Franklin Spaulding's informants were also apparently unaware that Jacquier had at the time just made a special study of Egyptian lotus symbolism and declared of this particular lotus arrangement, quote, "Nobody has a satisfactory explanation of this type of monument." The work still remains to be done, but at least we can find out what possible interpretations of the symbol an Egyptian would find acceptable. To begin with, in both Facsimile 1 and 3, we see an open lotus with buds above and below it, arching over a small stand with a fat little pitcher on it. Pitcher like a pitcher of water. In Facsimile 1, the stand is flanked by two thin jars, which are missing in Facsimile 3. And since the two drawings are given the identical interpretation, our attention is drawn to what they have in common: the lotus and the buds. Now, this lotus combination is common enough in coronation and court scenes, so it is quite at home in Facsimile 3. But so far as I know, this is the only lion couch scene adorned by the presence of a lotus stand. That in itself should be enough to make Egyptologists sit up and ask whether there might not be something special to this picture after all. If you will step into our Opet shrine, you will notice that there are no lotuses in the lion couch scene. So just realize, okay, we talked about this lotus is specific. Okay, so I made a comment earlier that says that there might be other ones with the lotus in it, but apparently there's not. So when people are talking, this is something that's fascinating. If you ever talk with somebody who's trying to prove Joseph Smith is not a prophet by showing that facsimile number 1 is out of the Book of the Dead, it's a common scene and it was misinterpreted, ask him, but what about the lotus? Show me where that lotus is in other of these scenes, and it'll be hard for them to find it because it's specific to the ones that Joseph Smith had, basically. That we have here. There might be other ones out there, but they're going to have the same meaning as what Joseph Smith gave, basically. All right, he says, so they're in the Opet shrine, looking around, and you'll notice there are no lotuses in the lion couch scene, but look around you at the other walls. What do you see? Jane says, lotuses everywhere. Mr. Jones, so conspicuous, in fact, that Professor Maxence de Roquemonnet, it's a big French word, concluded that the lotus must somehow express the basic idea of the Osiris cult as celebrated at this place. He even goes so far as to declare that the lotus and the papyrus are the emblems par excellence of Egyptian religion, exactly as the crescent is for the Muslims and the cross for the Christians, the symbolism being by no means confined to funerary situations. So Dick says, lotus and papyrus? Mr. Jones, the exact identification of these flowers has been the subject of endless discussion. Some have maintained that the papyrus of Upper Egypt is a lotus and the lotus of Lower Egypt a papyrus. Some that both flowers are lotuses, others that both are papyruses, and this confusion seems to go right back to the Egyptian artists themselves, who constantly and deliberately interchanged lotus and papyrus. But whatever their botanical classification may be, these two flowers enjoy a position of unique importance in Egypt, especially the lotus, which turns up everywhere in Egyptian art. Jane says, then it's just a decoration. Mr. Jones, far from it, though some scholars have insisted that there is no serious religious or symbolic significance, no rebus or code in the use of the lotus in decoration, the same authorities admit that apparently decorative use of the lotus may often conceal a sort of hieroglyphic code. If we know the value of these symbols, wrote Roquemonnet, not long ago, these ideograms, we can discover the dogmatic sense pursued by the designer, his piling up of emblems which at first sight simply astonished us. Thus the lotus and stand combination in the tomb of Seti I has adapted itself completely to the pattern of written symbols, as if it was trying to tell us something. And the same design in the tombs of the Pyramid Age may represent titles of the dead written in a specialized way, according to Edwards. So Dick says, so our lotus and stand may be trying to tell us something special after all. Mr. Jones says, it is the monopoly of a particular lotus that makes one suspicious. If all the Egyptians cared about was their decorative effect, what about all the other equally beautiful flowers they ignore? How is it that hieroglyphic flowers are almost exclusively lotuses? That only the blue and white lotuses are represented, though the rosy lotus was more decorative and more popular. That the lotuses, instead of being depicted in the free and easy manner of Egyptian artists, are almost always drawn after a very rigid pattern. That other plants never appear to compete with the lotus in heraldic contexts. Jane, what are heraldic contexts? Mr. Jones says, when the lotus appears as somebody's coat of arms. The lotus is the flower of Egypt par excellence, wrote Grenfell. Also, it is the symbol of Lower Egypt. The lotus is the typical arms of Egypt. On the other hand, in the earliest times, it would seem that the lotus stood for Upper Egypt and the papyrus for Lower Egypt, though Maspero and Moret held that the plants were both lotuses. So Dick says, the lotus can stand for both the land of Egypt and dead people. Mr. Jones, that isn't even the beginning of it. We seem to have a whole language of the lotus. Professors Siegfried Morenz and Johannes Schubert wrote a book about it and concluded that the various interpretations of the Egyptian lotus are in a state of hopeless confusion today. And Professor Rudolf Anthes has made a whole list of unanswered questions about the lotus. It is easy and pleasant to speculate, and there can be no doubt that there is something very fundamental about the lotus. It is easy to see why, for example, the lotus and papyrus always stood for Egypt in the minds of the people, since lotus and papyrus were essential constituents of this unchanging, significant landscape of the first time, as Frankfurt puts it. And because the lotus growing wild afforded ordinary food for the poor, it represents the prodigal, life giving abundance of the land. Also, the first life that appeared from the primordial waters of chaos was the lotus, emerging pure and white at Heliopolis out of the primordial ooze of the first land. That is why at On the lotus went by the special name of Nefertem, the god who represents the universe, who was before life existed and who will be when life has vanished, as Anthes puts it. It is the lotus that holds the secret of life springing up spontaneously, apparently out of nothing, during the long ages of desolation when only the empty waters existed. The seed of life slept in the lotus, ready to come forth on the first day. Within the lotus was Ra, the sun, waiting to be born as Kefri, according to the hymn from Edfu, the sleeper shall awake when the light comes forth from it. Hence the idea that all life finds earnest of the resurrection in the miracle of the lotus. The king is described in the pyramid text as being in the lotus at the moment he awakes from the sleep of death. As Anthes puts it, the lotus at Ra's nose gives him life for his daily journey. So if you ever see the pharaoh smelling lotuses, it's talking, not him going, oh, these are nice flowers. It's actually talking to him, giving him life for the resurrection, to renew him. This refers to the first day of the primal time when the primal lotus gave the sun the power to live and create. You can readily see why the lotus gets a big play in funerary scenes. Jane says, like lilies do today. Mr. Jones, botanically, the Egyptian lotus was a real lily. And since Ra and the king and Osiris were restored by the power of the lotus, so it was believed that everybody might enjoy the same privilege. But the funeral lotus is only part of the picture. In the latest lotus study, Munro shows how the lotus, being identified with Ra, is also the highest god, Atum Ra, at Heliopolis, and how as the father of the living king he must also be Osiris, and how as a living king he must also be Horus, and how father and son and Ra Harkati fuse in the composite form of Nefertem. This Nefertem seems to be the key to the whole business. A lot of studies have been written about him, one emphasizing one aspect of his nature and another. Nefertem is the king at Heliopolis, represented as a lotus and embodied as a lion. Dick says, lotus and lion? Mr. Jones, you will notice that the guardian lion with the big knife always has a huge lotus on his head or behind his back. We shall soon see why. As Nefertem, the king comes down from heaven to rule among men, bearing the lotus scepter that gives him all power on earth and below earth. But it is important to note that his lotus power is limited to his earthly kingdom alone. Nefertem is the representative of purely earthly kingship, as Anthes puts it. The pharaoh sits on a throne on which the intertwined lotus and papyrus shows his rule over the two lands, their stems also binding Asiatic and African prisoners back to back, showing that foreign lands are also brought under the beneficent sway of Pharaoh. On the same throne designs, you will see the king himself depicted as a lion treading on his foreign enemies. The lotus and lion are constantly found together in such context because they perform the same two functions, one protective, the other aggressive. Jane says, lotuses attack people? Mr. Jones says, yes, but first of all, they protect them. The gift of a lotus is often accompanied by the hieroglyphic symbols for protection. In the broadest sense, Nefertem, the lotus lion, protects the individual against anyone who might do him harm. That is why the lotus sign was put by the Egyptians on everything they want to protect, on utensils, clothes, houses, on their dresses, furniture, chairs, boats, fans, while in the tomb of the dead, the lotus sign was used as a talisman assuring an effective protection against its enemies. The power of the lotus, though formidable, is ever benign and protective in nature, as might be expected from its life giving power. So Dick says, but you said it was aggressive. Mr. Jones says, whenever you see a big lion with a knife, you can be almost sure of seeing a huge lotus on its head or back. The connection is explained by their common home in the marshes of the northeastern frontier of Egypt, where they both guarded the land against marauding Asiatics of the desert. The lion Nefertim and his companion or double, Maises, both worshipped in a lotus flower, were at home on the extreme northeastern borderlands, the home of Sopdu, right up against Arabia. You will recall that the great fortress there was called the Dwelling of the Lion and stood amidst the shallow lotus-filled lakes that, along with the crocodiles and the lions of the surrounding deserts, effectively discouraged unauthorized entry and exit. Right down to the time of the Caesars, it was one of the main duties of Pharaoh to protect this all-important gateway, and it was the custom to venerate the protector of this frontier of the land. At nearby Heliopolis, the king himself was Nefertim, both lotus and lion, or the guardian. Not only does the sight of him make the mountains, that is, the Asiatics, to flee, wrote Professor Naville, but he is the protector of the other divinities. His specialty is terrifying would-be invaders from the east, in which capacity he is also identified with the other lion god Maisis, who also wears the lotus. An inscription tells how Horus himself turned into a lion to drive the enemies of Egypt out of Heliopolis and back to the lion house on the border. Seth, the archetype of the wicked rebel and invader from the north and east, is stopped cold at the border by the lotus, Nefertim, who emerged from the primordial waters, who turned back Seth, who opposed the foreign countries when the heaven was overcast and the earth was wrapped in mist. In fact, in his tomb at Beni Hassan, Khnumhotep, lord of the Oryx province, had himself depicted approving the passport of 37 Semitic nomads. Their leader brings 2 desert oryx as gifts, while their donkeys carry bellows and metalworking tools. Their brightly colored robes and unusual instruments and weapons were exotic novelty. Khnumhotep may have chosen this scene as a testament to his power and compassion even to foreigners. Dick says, I can understand why a lion would chase strangers, but why a lotus? Mr. Jones says, Keyes found that odd too and suggested that it might be because a lotus stem will cut the fingers of anybody who tries to pull it up. But whatever the reason for it, this hostility brings the lotus, according to him, into a synchronistic relationship to the guardian deities of the eastern delta, or Sopdu, who made him to a frontier guard. It is obvious that the lotus is more symbolic than the fierce lion, but it plays an equally conspicuous role in the guarding of the northeast frontier. To the people in the hungry lands to the east, Egypt was something special. It was their last chance when they were starving. Remember the story of Joseph in Egypt? But while they were there, they hated the place and yearned to get back to their old bang-up life in the desert. They were a dangerous lot, and the Egyptian records show that they were carefully checked at the border, and that their every move was watched while they were in Egypt. Ephraim Spicer has spoken of a societal curtain that separated Egypt and Mesopotamia. Call it the lotus curtain, if you will. He too perceived the symbol of the lotus. So Dick says, but why did the Egyptians let the Asiatics in at all? Couldn't they keep them out? Mr. Jones says, they not only didn't keep them out, oh crap, I just lost my place. I hate it when it does that. Okay. I tapped a button and it scrolled back up for me. I hate it when it does that. Let's see. There's a lot. I hope you're understanding this. It's just fascinating. Just fascinating how much there is in here. Let's see. Okay, they not only didn't keep them out, they actually offered them protection. Therein, I think we can see the unique greatness of Egypt. Monet pointed out that the Egyptians, contrary to what we have been taught to think, were really great travelers, and, in what is even more surprising, that the 2 main duties of Pharaoh were to keep the movements of the Asiatics into and within Egypt under strict control, and to protect Egyptian travelers, missionaries, merchants, and artisans abroad. Now, the concern for the helpless in a strange place is the special concern of Nefertim. In funerary reliefs, the dead, newly arrived in the netherworld, are drawn without arms to show their condition of utter helplessness in a strange and frightening world. While they are in that condition, Nefertem comes to their rescue, puts his arms around them, and finally gives them a new set of arms, saying, "There now, you have become whole and complete. Now you have your arms." Meaning, as Naville put it, that the dead person is now a complete person who has been entirely reconstituted. He lacked arms, but the gods of the East have given him theirs. Jane says, "Who are the gods of the East?" Mr. Jones says, "None other than the two lions, Nefertem and Maisis, with their huge lotus crowns." The concern for strangers is very significant, for in many scenes and inscriptions, the lotus stands for both guest and host. The lotus, god Harsmatuus, is called a guest in Dendera. And if you were invited to party in Egypt, especially at the royal palace, etiquette would require you to bring a lotus with you and present it to your host. There is a regular formula for coming with a bouquet of Ammon, lord of the thrones of the two lands in Karnak, after doing all that is commended, and a proper way to address one's host: "To thy Ka, happy king, lord of the two lands, whom Ra loves, a bouquet of thy father Ammon. Mayest thou remain on the throne of the living Horus like Ra forever." Now, this is plainly a New Year's gift for the throne, which seems to have been the origin of the idea. Remember that the lotus represents the birth of everything at the cosmic New Year. Another formula is coming in peace with a bouquet of Ammon, with the compliments of his beloved son. This being followed not by the name of Horus, as you might expect, but by the name of the donor. When the king appears in a reception on the throne, people bring him their Ammon bouquets with wishes for a happy lifetime in the royal dwelling. It was a birthday gift as well as a New Year's gift. So Dick says, "But why should anybody have to give lotuses to the king if they belong to his father Ammon in the first place?" Mr. Jones says, "No idea was more familiar to the ancients than to the pious truism that the God who receives the gifts of the earth as offerings is after all the real source of those same offerings. An inscription has the king bring a lotus to Horus, who himself arose from the lotus, and Ramside stelae show people bringing lotuses to a queen who is already holding a lotus and stands completely decked and surrounded with lotuses." So Jane says, But would you have to bring a lotus to the party? Couldn't you bring something else?" Mr. Jones says, "No. It is always a lotus, and that shows clearly that it is a ritual and a symbolic thing. Naturally, the people who got invited to court, high nobility and officials for the most part, vied with each other in the splendor of their offerings and flatteries, until in the 18th dynasty, the Ammon bouquets finally got too big to handle. But no matter how showy and vulgar they got, the bouquets always had a lotus as a centerpiece. An inscription on the tomb of Amenemhab, says of a lotus bearer, "He comes as one welcome, bringing the life of Ammon," to which his host replies, "To thy person the symbol of life of Ammon, who is pleased with thee, who loves thee and admits thee." Here the word for admit is meaning to make a place for a person, like the Arabic marhaban, welcome to the party. So Dick says, "So the lotus is really sort of a ticket then?" Mr. Jones, "Well, yes, like the tesserae hospitales of the Greeks and Romans. Every guest brings a token for his host and receives one in return, often the identical gift. Thus the Egyptian brought a lotus to Pharaoh as a sign of submission and love, which lotus he professed to have received from the king's father Ammon, the giver of all blessings, including life itself. All were expected to bring such a gift, coming in peace to that place where the king is. With the expansion of empire, Ammon became the god of all the lands under Egyptian sway, and the Egyptian lotus is as conspicuous in throne scenes from Palestine and Syria as it is in Egypt itself. Indeed, the object of Moran's and Schubert's cooperative study is to trace the spreading of the royal lotus motif from Egypt all over the Old World, among Among the Joseph Smith papyri is one very fine picture of the four sons of Horus, the canoptic figures, standing on an enormous lotus before the king on his throne. That's number 3, facsimile 3. Here the lotus represents all the regions of the earth brought under the sway of Egypt. How fascinating. Oh my gosh. Who would guess that that little symbol right there in the corner would mean so much and is so rare to be found in these images. So whenever you see this image or something similar to this, look for the lotus and you'll probably not find it because it's very unique to here, but it means Abraham in Egypt. It means power, God, all kinds of great stuff. So cool, so amazing. All right, I hope your head's probably just it's just amazing what there is in this chapter, or not chapter, but this facsimile. So much in one picture. How cool is that? This is the fun of hieroglyphics in Egypt. Okay, now let's finally get to number 11. That was a whole lot about that lotus. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Now let's get to number 11, figure 11, designed to represent the pillars of heaven as understood by the Egyptians. So figure 11 is down here in the bottom, basically, okay? So these are the pillars of heaven. So here's what we get to learn about this one that Hugh talks about. He says, I'm afraid the successive engravers of facsimile 1 have done us all a disservice by turning the gates of heaven into a meaningless and untidy jumble of vertical lines arbitrarily and irregularly connected by crude horizontal strokes. But the original papyrus is a different story. It shows us 10 clearly drawn gates or a series of pylons. If we are looking for parallels, we don't have to go far. Egyptian art is full of them. So there's a difference between the original facsimile and this one that we have here. This one is based on them filling in the gaps of what was there, basically, and the original actually shows those pillars better, more accurately than just a bunch of random lines looking things, basically. The characteristic of the earliest royal tombs is the decorations of their outer surfaces with what is called the palace facade style of recessed paneling, a long line of imitation doors flanked by square pillars. The structure is abundantly illustrated on the earliest seals showing the elaborate palace gate or serek design. What is a serek? The picture of the entrance to a tomb or palace, a rectangular door flanked by massive supports, sometimes extended into towers on each side, usually with a big hawk perched right above the gate between the pillars. Heinrich Balks has collected over a dozen different types for comparison. To him, the structure suggests a fortress, Wehrbaru, but he has no doubt that the central panel is always a door. The label, Gateway of the Two Lands, shows that the door was identified with the palace gate, though high officials were sometimes allowed by special courtesy to employ the motif in their own tombs. The same design was employed in the tomb as in the palace, especially in the earliest dynasties, and Balks maintains that the false door of an Old Kingdom tomb was really a niche to which the significance of a passage for the dead was attributed. The earliest stelae, which were certainly not houses, also have the same false door and panel design, which also repeated on the sides of wooden coffins, where we find the same vertical lines with empty spaces in between, designated by the experts as pillars with false doors between them. And the same motif is used to decorate the sides of boxes and chests designed to hold any precious objects. Professor Balks reaches the sensible conclusion that the false door on funerary objects must represent a passage for the dead. We still do not understand the undoubtedly religious significance of such a curious architectural phenomenon. While some maintained that the peculiar structure of the palace facade style was the result of building in brick, others held that the design was imported into both Egypt and Mesopotamia from northern Syria, where they built in wood. And while some suggested that all the vertical rills were for drainage, others pointed out that there was no need for drainage in Upper Egypt, and that the pylons and pillars must therefore have a special significance. This is indicated by the fact that in Mesopotamia, this particular building style, which closely resembles the Egyptian structures of Thinite and pre-dynastic periods, is employed only in temples, surveying the phenomenon throughout the whole ancient East. Stuart Pigott writes, an essential part of the temple decor was an elaborate system of niches and reveals which appear to have been a mark of religious as opposed to secular architecture. In Egypt, whether the false door of the palace facade is the gate of the house of the dead, as Balkh calls it, or the door of divine residence, as Ludwig Borchardt calls it, it is always a passageway into another world, a sacred ceremonial gate of heaven or the underworld. The bottom frame in Facsimile 1 resembles the recessed paneling of the Syriac structures called palace facade, and going back to the royal residence of pre-dynastic times, representing the pillars flanking the doorway to the royal residence, palace, temple, or pillars of heaven. So figure 11 recalls the 15 gates in the great enclosure at Saqqara. So fascinating, absolutely fascinating stuff here. That there's not just they're not just a bunch of lines. That they actually have very significant importance to understanding the gates of heaven, or the entrance, the way to get to the other world, basically. How cool is that? All right, figure 12. This one's a really interesting one because you think, why is that a figure? It's the land. Shouldn't that be like the land? It has all these angled, slanted lines going in opposite directions, and the crocodile is down in there as well. Joseph Smith tells us figure 12 is called Rao Ki Yang, signifying expanse, or the firmament over our heads. But in this case, in relation to the subject, the Egyptians meant it to signify Shao Mao, to be high, or the heavens, answering to the Hebrew word Shao Mayim. Wow. So he gets some significance in here of understanding here's what it normally means, but in this significance, it means this. So let's talk about this. This is the waters of heaven, if you will. Any doubt about that is removed by a fragment from the 11th dynasty tomb, which shows just such a crocodile as this one against just such a zigzag background as that shown here. So there is a tomb of an 11th dynasty pharaoh that shows that exact zigzag line with the crocodile in it. These horizontal rows of hatchlings in alternating directions are a common Egyptian way of showing big waters. On the sarcophagus of Seti I, they are used to depict the waters of the cosmic ocean. But the most instructive parallels to our papyrus, I think, are found in the tomb of Ramses IX. Here in one scene above just such a series of pylons as are pillars of heaven, we find a series of 5 to 7 long horizontal bands of hatched lines, the strokes moving in contrary directions to give a zigzag effect representing water. Upon this mass of zigzags, the heavenly barks are sailing. Those are the barges, the boats basically are sailing. It is very neatly done, for this was being put on the wall of a great king's tomb. The horizontal bands are perfectly straight and the hatching strokes are perfectly even and regular. It was all done with rulers, though the guidelines today are invisible. In some scenes, however, the artist tried to do the job freehand, and though he was very skillful, just such a crocodile as this one against just such a zigzag background as that shown here, these horizontal rows of hatchings in alternating directions are a common Egyptian way of showing big waters. On the sarcophagus of Seti I, they are used to depict the waters of the cosmic ocean. Same thing. But the most instructive parallels to our papyrus, I think, are found in the... Oh, wait, I think I copied that one again. That's so weird. Okay, so let me jump ahead here. Upon the massive zigzags, the heavenly barks are sailed. It's very neatly done. Horizontal bands. However, the artist tried to do the job freehand. So he got tired before he finished, and his horizontal zigzag strips got all out of line. Sorry about that. Apparently, I copied it twice when I was putting this in my scriptures. Now, the artist of Joseph Smith Papyrus 1 was not making a carefully supervised adornment for an everlasting royal memorial, but merely dashing off a small freehand sketch. So to get his 5 lines of hatching straight, he does not hesitate to draw in guidelines. The neat way would have been to use a ruler, but that would also have been the hard way, and there can be no doubt that the same waters are being represented in the papyrus as in the tomb. Egyptians started out with the common sense conception of heaven as a flood, spreading its expanse of blue waters above the earth. The Lady Nut and the Hathor cow, though quite primitive, being nothing else but personifications of this great flood, this remaining the basic Egyptian theory of the firmament forever after. It was a vast expanse of waters, the very waters depicted in the tomb drawings and in our identical design on the Joseph Smith papyrus. So fascinating, because when we look at even in the book of Genesis, in understanding the heavens and the earth, they talk about the waters separating from the waters, using the similar analogy that the Egyptians use of understanding the expanse of heaven as waters. Probably because when you look up during the day, the sky is blue and water is blue. So it must be kind of the same thing. It's water up there and then water down here, the expanse of heaven kind of a deal. And it rains, so water comes out of that sky down. So there's a lot of understanding and, in their minds, logic behind that. The Egyptian adds a special secondary meaning to the design and explains that this is not the ordinary one, but in this case, in relation to this subject, the Egyptians meant it to signify Shaumau, to be high. That is, they wanted to emphasize in the special context one particular aspect of the heavens, their height and aloofness. So another way to look at this is the waters of Nun, shown in figure 12, bathe the sacred crocodile, who is Sobek, if you remember back on the story of the lotus. Indeed, the idolatrous god of Pharaoh and the chief patron of the monarchy. So even that can be a symbol of the Egyptians as well. So that concludes our discussion on facsimile number 1. I know this was a long video. We'll have the chapters so that it breaks it down a little bit easier to go back and reference some of these different points. And then the link, of course, to get all the notes. But just realize how amazing it is what we learn just from this one facsimile. So much to learn, so much to gain, and help us understand the story of Abraham, the Egyptian lore and legends behind it, how that all culminates and pulls together to show us that what Joseph Smith gave us in the interpretation is completely accurate, completely true, and is amazing. There's nothing more to me, and Hugh Nibley points this out as well in his writings, that really the pearl of great price does more to prove Joseph Smith as a prophet, a real true prophet, than the Book of Mormon does. The Book of Mormon is great, but we can't corroborate it. We can corroborate all this stuff in Egyptian history, and we're showing that Joseph Smith was right. He got it right before all the Egyptologists even knew what it was. Now that we understand what it is, at first they said, no, Joseph Smith can't be right. It's this, it's this, it's this. But now as we've looked further and further and further into more and more research, now we realize Joseph was right in his interpretations of these things. How amazing that is. So stay tuned. The next video, admittedly, is facsimile 2, which we have even more notes on. So it is just facsimile 2. The hypocephalus is mind-bending. It's going to be a long video, so just have patience with us and go through that video. You're really going to enjoy it. So we'll see you then.